My name is Erica. I am a 35-year-old housewife, living with my husband Brian and our 2-year-old daughter. I am very happy living with my kind husband and adorable daughter. But I had once gone through a painful experience due to a failed marriage. My former husband, Fred, cheated on me, and when his mistress got pregnant, he left a divorce notice and walked out of our house. I was initially shocked and saddened by the divorce, but now I feel that it was good that we parted ways. Fred used to be kind and cherished me at the beginning of our marriage. But he became cold after about a year. I had a suspicion why Fred started treating me coldly. Shortly after we got married, my father said to us, "Show me your child's face soon. Erica is my only child. So I am counting on you to continue the family line." At first, neither Fred nor I were too concerned about having children. But my father's repeated requests to see his grandchild troubled us. Nowadays, continuing the family line isn't important, right? We're not from a prestigious family, so please don't worry about that. Despite what I said, my father seemed to really want me to have a child soon. Fred, who was intimidated by my stern-looking father from the beginning, took his words more seriously than I did. "Maybe we should consider fertility treatments, for your father's sake?" I told my worried husband that we could ignore my father. I think my father's fixation on having a grandchild stemmed from losing my mother to illness just before we got married. After losing my mother, my family consisted only of my father, who seemed lonely after I married and moved out. Since we lived close to my parents' house after getting married, my father was overjoyed when we visited. I actually wanted to live with my father, but Fred was against it. "I'm not really comfortable with your father, so I'd rather not live together." Fred never expressed a desire to live together. My father, feeling lonely living alone, probably hoped for a grandchild as an excuse to visit us, thinking he would like to see his grandchild soon. I lightly thought we would have children eventually. But Fred was concerned about my father's words. "I don't want to be complained at by your father for not having children forever. So let's undergo fertility treatment to have a child soon." Despite my father not being pushy, Fred misunderstood and suggested fertility treatments. Confused, I consulted with my father, who was surprised. "There's no need for fertility treatments." I feel bad for Fred. My father apologized to Fred, but Fred insisted on going through with the treatments. Fred wanted to prove through the tests that he wasn't the cause of our infertility and show my father he was wrong. Even when I told Fred there was no need for treatments, he was stubborn about undergoing them. Seeing Fred's condition, my father thought he had said something wrong and suddenly became dispirited. I don't think it was guilt that made him feel unwell, but after a while, my father collapsed at work and was rushed to the hospital. I hurried to the hospital, where the doctor told me it was a heart attack. It seemed to be a dangerous situation. I informed Fred about my father's collapse, but he never showed up at the hospital, leaving me to accompany my father alone, filled with anxiety. While I was alone with my unconscious father, Fred called late at night. "Pick up the fertility treatment test results while you're there. It would be a waste if your father passes away now that we've started treatment." Fred hung up after saying just that. We had just started fertility treatments at the hospital, where my father was rushed to in an emergency, and both of us had been tested a little while ago. I was furious with Fred, who, instead of worrying about my father in critical condition, was preoccupied with our fertility treatment. The cost of the fertility treatment, which my father felt sorry for Fred and decided to bear, ended with Fred presumptuously deciding there was a problem with me not being able to have children from the start. My family has always had many children, so there couldn't be a problem with me. I have many siblings, but Erica, you're an only child, right? Fred spoke as if he had already won. Fortunately, my father regained consciousness, but his condition remained critical. At that time, I was still working as an employee and would visit the hospital every day after work to check on my father. When I told Fred about my late returns, he seemed somewhat pleased. "Don't worry about me. If I had known it would come to this, I wouldn't have bothered with the fertility treatments." Fred said this without any concern for my father. Displeased with Fred's attitude, I ignored him and didn't respond. As I visited my father after work every day, my return home became later and later. But Fred was always absent. Initially, he would come home late at night, but eventually, he almost stopped coming home altogether. It seemed he would come home to change clothes occasionally, but chose times when I wasn't there, and we completely stopped seeing each other. Before my father was hospitalized, Fred had come home late at times but had never stayed out overnight. I was busy caring for my father and not often home, which probably gave Fred the freedom he thought he had. I believed that spouses should help each other in times of need. But even when things got tough for me, Fred did nothing. Nearly a year after my father collapsed, even on the rare occasions Fred and I saw each other at home, we no longer spoke. Then one day, "How much wealth does your father have? Your family home is a rental, right?" He suddenly asked about my father's wealth when we met after a long time. And I responded irritably, "Why would you ask that all of a sudden? My father doesn't have much in terms of wealth." I was already upset with Fred for not visiting my father, so I didn't tell him the truth. Fred seemed to take my words seriously and left in a huff to go somewhere else. I grew angry at Fred's indifference to my father's condition and his unrelated inquiries about my father's wealth. During this time, I was overwhelmed with caring for my father and dealing with Fred, making it difficult to concentrate at work, but my colleagues went out of their way to help me. A senior male colleague, in particular, helped me with my work so I could leave for the hospital earlier, for which I was always grateful. "Thank you for your help." When I thanked him, the senior colleague smiled and responded, "Don't mention it. Just go see your father." Not just the senior colleague but other coworkers were also kind, making me feel grateful compared to Fred, who did nothing to help. While being supported by my colleagues and caring for my father, he passed away after a while. I didn't want to inform Fred, who seemed to be waiting for my father's death, but I reluctantly called him. "I'm not going to help with the funeral. Someone without assets is not my concern." Fred hung up after saying that. Although I hadn't expected any help with the funeral, his blunt disregard made me irate. During the funeral, my coworkers helped out, which I greatly appreciated. "Don't hesitate to ask for anything. I know losing your father is hard, but we're all here to support you." Hearing this from a senior employee made me nearly cry with gratitude. After the funeral, supported by my colleagues, I returned home to find a letter on the table. The letter stated that Fred was divorcing me to live with his mistress, who was pregnant, and included a divorce notice signed by Fred. Reading the note, I was shocked but had somehow anticipated this might happen. Watching Fred's recent behavior, I had a feeling he was cheating, but I never imagined there was a child involved. I was thinking of sitting down with Fred to talk about our future once things settled down. Anger bubbled up in me as Fred admitted to the affair and left. So I decided to demand a fair amount of the property division. I tried calling his mobile phone but couldn't get through, so I ended up calling Fred's parents' house. Fred's parents were also unaware that he had run off with his mistress, and were shocked to hear my story. I can't forgive a son who runs off with his mistress, especially at a time when you're mourning your father. I'll cover the property division for now, and make sure Fred pays me back later. In the end, I accepted the property division from Fred's father. After submitting the divorce papers and parting ways with Fred, I moved back to live at my parents' house. There was no issue with inheriting my father's estate as I was the only heir. But I left the paperwork to a professional since it was complicated. With my father gone and Fred off with his mistress, I suddenly felt very lonely. Maybe I seemed distracted at work because a senior colleague approached me. "You seem tired, are you okay? If you're having trouble, feel free to talk to me." Grateful for his constant concern, I decided to invite him out for a meal. After a few dinners out, my senior colleague and I began dating with the intention of marrying. Having been betrayed by Fred, I thought I'd never want to marry again. But I felt I could make it work with my kind senior colleague. After dating for about a year, we got married, had a daughter, and lived happily. Since our daughter was born, I quit my job to become a full-time housewife. I felt grateful all over again for marrying my husband, who was supportive with childcare and household chores. Maybe it wouldn't be so bad to have another child. As we took care of our daughter, my husband mentioned this, and I agreed. After a while, we discovered I was pregnant again, and both my husband and I were thrilled, with our daughter excited to become a big sister. On the day of my prenatal checkup, my husband had the day off. So we left our daughter with his parents and went to the hospital together. Sitting in the waiting room with my husband, I remembered the fertility treatments I had undergone with my previous husband. I had tests done at this hospital because I couldn't have children with my former husband. What were the test results? Just as I was about to tell my husband about the results, someone called out to me. "Hey, isn't that Erica? Are you still continuing with fertility treatments?" Turning to the voice, I saw Fred smirking. I hadn't expected Fred, who had left me, to approach me. "No, that's not it. I'm here for a prenatal checkup because I'm pregnant," I replied coldly, and Fred, familiar as ever, started talking. "Is this guy next to you your new husband? So you finally had a child after all those fertility treatments?" Fred assumed I was still undergoing treatments, but I decided ignoring him was best, realizing arguing was futile. Then, Fred mockingly added insult. "So, you're in debt from all the fertility treatments, huh? That's sad." Far from apologizing for running off, Fred spoke spitefully, fueling my anger. "Whose story are you telling? I have no debts. You're the one who owes your father money." I wasn't sure if Fred knew about the property division his father covered, but I was too upset not to mention it. Fred glared at me in response, and then my husband spoke up. "Didn't you know Erica comes from a wealthy family? I guess if you knew, you wouldn't have divorced her, right?" My husband spoke with a dismissive tone, and Fred's expression turned even more hostile. Erica's mother was the daughter of a wealthy family, so Erica inherited a significant amount. Though my husband spoke softly, Fred, upon hearing the truth, shouted so loudly it echoed through the waiting room. I never heard such a thing." Seeing other patients looking at us, I decided to calm Fred down. "Please, don't raise your voice. I just didn't want to tell someone who wouldn't even visit his father-in-law when he was ill." As I spoke softly, Fred was trembling with anger. When I married Fred, I didn't think it was necessary to tell him. But I had inherited a significant fortune from my deceased mother. My father and I shared my mother's inheritance, and when my father passed away, I also inherited his share. My mother's family used to be major landowners, and being an only child like me, she inherited everything. Initially, the land wasn't considered very valuable, but it appreciated significantly as development progressed, which even surprised my mother. Even after inheritance taxes, we still have assets worth about $20 million. As my husband disclosed the amount, adding insult to injury for Fred, he frantically demanded from me. We didn't divide the inheritance when we divorced, right? Give me half of your fortune. I informed the confused Fred with a smug look. Inherited property isn't subject to division in a divorce. Tough luck. Realizing that my assets were not subject to division, Fred became utterly dejected. There was something else I had to tell him, so I said it with a laugh. It's late, but let me tell you the results of the fertility treatment. The reason we couldn't have children was because of you. Fred, realizing he wouldn't get any money, seemed indifferent to the fertility treatment news. I think you should get a DNA test for the child your mistress is carrying. I suspect you've been deceived by your mistress. Fred seemed to understand what I said and started shaking. At that moment, a woman appeared where the three of us were talking. Sorry to keep you waiting, the baby is doing fine. Oh. Are these people friends of Fred's? The smiling woman who approached us seemed to be Fred's mistress. Are you Fred's wife? Please have a healthy baby. With that, my husband and I moved to a different seat, leaving Fred and his mistress behind. As we left, Fred yelled at his mistress. Whose child is in your stomach? And the eldest son isn't mine, right? Fred caused a commotion, and his mistress, surprised, hurried out of the waiting room. Fred followed his mistress out, and the waiting room quieted down. My husband and I exchanged glances, trying to suppress our laughter. Is the test result true? My husband thought I was bluffing, but it was the truth. I had forgotten about it with my father's funeral and Fred's disappearance. But I was shocked when the hospital contacted me with the results. Although Fred wrote in his letter that his mistress was pregnant with his child, I doubted it was truly his. Despite believing it was no longer my concern, I was surprised to end up telling him the truth at the hospital. I wondered if the child was really Fred's, but it was no longer my concern until Fred called me. Just like Erica said, the child wasn't mine. I was deceived by her. Can we start over? I was dumbfounded by Fred's audacity, but felt relieved to know the child wasn't his. There's no way I'm getting back with someone who left. Instead, pay back the property division your father covered for you. Fred seemed not to hear me and continued pleading for a reunion while crying. If you call again, I'll report you for stalking. After that, the calls stopped. Fred's father later informed me that Fred's mistress had multiple other partners, and it was unclear whose child it was. After panicking about the pregnancy, she convinced Fred the child was his, and they eloped. After breaking up with his mistress, Fred returned home but fled again when asked to repay the property division. Apparently, he had also accumulated a significant debt while living with his mistress. And even his own family refused to shelter him when debt collectors pursued him. Realizing a reconciliation was impossible, Fred, with nowhere else to turn, disappeared. I hope he doesn't get arrested for engaging in illegal activities. My family is eagerly awaiting the arrival of my unborn child, whose gender we don't yet know. My husband and daughter are already thinking of names and talking to my belly. I plan to use the wealth inherited from my parents carefully for the benefit of my children.